The forest was a maze of twisted trees and whispering shadows, a place where the air seemed heavy with secrets. Elias trudged through it, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He hadn't intended to wander this far from the trail. The hours had blurred into a fog of fatigue, and the fading light of late afternoon painted the forest in sickly yellows and grays. His prey, a wounded deer, had long since disappeared, leaving only bloodstains on the leaves that grew paler and paler with each step. He was about to turn back when he saw the hut. It was nestled between two massive oak trees like a lurking predator, its wooden walls blackened with age and rot. The roof sagged under a blanket of moss, and a thin thread of smoke curled out of the crooked chimney, dissolving into the fog. Elias froze. So deep in the forest there were no roads, no signs of life for miles around. And yet here he was, undeniable and wrong, as if he had grown out of the earth itself. His stomach twisted with unease, but curiosity gnawed at him. He approached, each step crunching louder than the last on the carpet of brittle branches. The windows were dark, smeared with dirt, and the door, a slab of split wood, hung slightly ajar. From inside came a faint hum, low and guttural, like a song being swallowed up by the wind. Elias raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. The air smelled faintly of iron and rot, pungent enough to bring tears to his eyes. Before he could make a decision, the door creaked open wider on its own, revealing a patch of darkness inside. Something moved, a flicker of pale, bony fingers wrapped around the frame. Elias stepped back, his heart pounding against his ribs, as a voice came from the shadows. "Lost, are you?" It was dry and cracked, like leaves rustling on stone, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He hadn't seen her yet, but he knew she was there, watching, waiting, and the hut, silent and motionless, seemed to lean closer, as if it, too, was eager to see what he would do next. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the voice slipped out of the hut. He wanted to run, every instinct screamed at him to turn and run back into the forest, but his legs wouldn't obey. The air grew thicker, squeezing his chest like a hand, and the faint hum he'd heard earlier turned into a rhythmic buzzing that pulsed through his skull. "Come in," the voice said, softer now, almost coaxing. Bony fingers stepped away from the door frame, disappearing into the darkness. Elias gripped his rifle tighter, the cold metal grounding him as he squeezed out a shaky breath. "Who's there?" There was a low laugh in response, sharp and fragmented, cutting through the drone. Then she came into view, or rather, she unfolded in it. The woman was incredibly tall, her body bent like a broken branch, her head touching the door jamb. Her skin was gray and wrinkled, stretched tightly over bones that stuck out at unnatural angles. Strands of greasy white hair hung in clumps around her face, which was dominated by a wide mouth without lips, and her eyes were like black pits, sunken and unblinking. She was wearing a shabby shawl that trembled slightly, as if it were made of living things. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice swirling around the words like smoke. "The forest told me you would come." Elias's mouth went dry. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. No one knew he was here. "I was just passing through," he managed to say, taking a step back. The ground beneath him shifted, a sickening lurch, and he looked down to see the ground stirring, roots twisting upward as fingers grabbed at his boots. "Don't be rude," she hissed, tilting her head at an angle that made his stomach churn. "You've already taken something of mine." She gestured to the stains of blood on his hands, deer blood, and smiled, baring teeth that looked like split thorns. "Come and repay me." The door opened wide, and the stench hit him, a wave of rot and wet fur mixed with something sweeter, sickening. Inside, the hut was incredibly large, its walls stretching into the shadows, lined with shelves that bent under jars of murky liquid. Something thumped softly from within, a heartbeat, faint but insistent. Elias's resolve cracked. He turned to run, but the trees behind him closed in, their branches intertwined in a cage. The witch's humming grew louder, vibrating in his bones, and he realized with horror that it wasn't coming from her, it was coming from the hut itself. Elias's pulse pounded in his ears as the forest closed behind him, the gnarled tree branches snapping like jaws. He turned back to the hut, the witch still looming in the doorway, her black eyes glinting with something predatory. The humming from the hut pulsed faster, synchronizing with his rapid heartbeat, and he felt her pulling him toward her, tugging at his thoughts, his will. "You can't leave," she said, her voice a low growl that resonated in his chest. "Not until you pay." She stepped aside, gesturing into the open mouth of the hut with a claw-like hand. The shadows inside shifted, and for a moment Elias swore he saw a figure, a deer standing on its hind legs, antlers scraping the ceiling before it melted back into the darkness. "I didn't take anything," he stammered, clutching his rifle. "The deer, it ran away on its own. I don't owe you." "Liar," she spat, and the air crackled. The blood on his hands began to itch and then burn as if it were alive, seeping into his skin. He yelped, dropping the rifle to scrub his palms, but the stains only spread, dark tendrils snaking up his wrists. "You spilled his life. You marked my wood. Now you will give me something in return." The ground shuddered, and a wet, slithering sound came from the shadow of the hut. Something crawled to the surface, a mass of sinew and fur, eyeless and trembling, with too many legs bent the wrong way. It whimpered, a sound like a child's sob, and Elias's stomach lurched as he realized it was or had been the deer he had shot. Its flesh throbbed, half-formed, as if caught in mid-transformation. "Take it back," the witch murmured, her smile growing wider. "Or give me something better." She pointed a crooked finger at his chest, and he felt a sharp jolt not on his body, but deeper, as if she had touched his soul and pulled. He was seized with panic. He swung the rifle, his hands shaking, and fired. The shot sounded deafening in the silence, and the bullet hit her right in the chest. She did not flinch. Instead, the wound bubbled, black ichor oozed from it, and the bullet fell to the ground, wriggling like a worm before burying itself in the ground. The witch laughed a wet, gurgling sound, and the walls of the hut shook, groaning as if alive. "You will stay," she said, and the shadows charged. Tendrils of darkness burst out, wrapped around his ankles and wrists, and dragged him to the door. He screamed as he struggled, but the rifle slipped from his hands, swallowed up by the floorboards, which opened like a hungry mouth. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was her face hovering inches from his own, her breath hot and rancid as she whispered, "We're just getting started." Elias hit the floor of the hut hard, his bones shaking, but the wood beneath him was soft, too soft, like flesh buckling under his weight. The door closed behind him with a wet thud, sealing in the last shred of gray daylight. The air inside was thick, suffocating, full of the stench of rot, and a sickly sweet tang that came up to his throat. The buzzing became deafening, a chorus of vibrations that made his teeth grind and his vision blur. He scrambled to his feet, groping in the darkness, and came across something cold and slippery, the wall, which pulsed slightly under his touch. His fingers recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows pressed, alive and shuddering, and the witch's voice echoed from every direction. "You wanted to hunt. Now you will learn what it means to be the prey." Above him, a dim greenish glow flickered, emanating from a chandelier of twisted bones and sinews. It swayed, dripping something viscous onto the floor, and illuminated the room, or what was supposed to be a room. The space stretched incredibly far, its edges dissolving into a haze of fog and shadow. On all sides were shelves lined with jars that bubbled and twitched, their contents pressed against glass-clawed hands, eyeless eyes, and mouths that opened and closed in silent screams. Elias's gaze darted to the center of the room, where a table carved from a single slab of blackened wood stood. On it lay a deer, its mangled body sprawled out, its ribs cracked like a book. Its heart was still beating, slowly and unhurriedly, tied to the surface of the table by strings of tendons. But it was not alone. Next to him, a second figure twitched, a human figure, or what was left of it. The skin was torn off, stripped in stripes, and the eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets from which red tears flowed. He turned his head toward Elias and groaned, a sound that pierced his mind. "You're not the first," the witch said, her voice now behind him. He turned around, but she wasn't there until she appeared out of the mist, her body stretching as she rose above him. Her shawl swirled, and now he saw that it was made of tiny, writhing creatures, dwarves with human faces that gnashed their tiny teeth. "They all come. They all break." She reached out for him, her fingers stretching, her knuckles crunching as they reached for his face. Elias ducked, stumbling, and his foot sank into something soft. He looked down and gagged as a hatch opened beneath him, revealing a pit of gleaming flesh, studded with teeth and tongues that lolled upward. He yanked his leg out, the skin burning where it touched, and threw himself against the shelves, desperate to escape. But the hut shifted. The walls leaned inward, the floor tilted, and the jars began to break, spilling their horror onto the ground. The clawed creatures shuffled toward him, dragging wet footprints behind them, and the ragged figure on the table sat up, its eyeless face watching his every move. The witch's laughter filled the air, a sound like shattering glass, and Elias realized with a sickening jolt that the hum was not just in his head, it was his own voice, a scream ripped from his throat without his consent. Elias's scream turned into a continuous hum of the hut, a sound he couldn't stop, as if the air itself had taken over his lungs and squeezed. The floor buckled beneath him, forcing him to his knees, and even more grotesque insect-flesh hybrids crawled out of the broken jars, tiny mouths snapping with hunger. He swung at them, his hands clammy with sweat and dried deer blood, but they clung to his skin, sinking their needle-sharp teeth beneath it. The witch loomed over him, her figure stretching and contorting, her head touching the swaying chandelier. A greenish glow cast her face in sharp relief, revealing cracks in her skin that oozed viscous sludge. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice splitting into a dozen overlapping tones, each scratching at different corners of his mind. "Piece by piece, I will take you apart and put you back together. Better. Stronger. Mine." The ragged figure from the table leaned forward, its movements jerky and irregular, like a puppet on frayed strings. It reached for him with skeletal arms, fingertips glistening with fresh blood, and Elias jumped back, his spine crashing into the shelf. The impact knocked over a few more jars, and their contents burst out a writhing mass of tentacles, a swarm of eyeless butterflies pulsing with light streaks. They were coming at him, a tide of nightmare, and he kicked wildly, his boots sinking into their soft, pliable bodies. Luke opened his mouth wider, his fleshy jaw gnashing, and the deer creature crawled toward him, dragging his throbbing heart like an anchor. Elias's gaze was fixed on it, and for a moment he saw its eyes, human eyes, wide with terror, pleading. Then it was gone, sucked down into the pit with a wet scream that echoed from depths he could not fathom. The hut shuddered, the walls groaned as if in pleasure, and the witch clapped her hands, the sound sharp and final. "You will join them," she said, crouching low, her face inches from his. Her breath was a furnace of decay, and her eyes, those bottomless pits, seemed to pull at his soul, unraveling it thread by thread. "But first, try it." Her tongue darted out, long and barbed, and brushed across his cheek. It burned like acid, peeling away the skin, and he howled, hitting the shelf. The room spun, or perhaps he spun, his vision shattered into shards of green light and shadow. The humming grew louder and louder, drowning out his thoughts, and now he felt that the hut was not just alive, it was hungry. The walls pulsed faster, streaks of rot permeated the wood, and the floor trembled, tilting him toward the pit. He scratched at the shelves, his fingers wrapped around a jar that squirmed in his hand. Without hesitation, he threw it at her, and it smashed against her chest, unleashing a writhing mass of eel-like creatures that plunged into her flesh and disappeared. She swayed, just for a moment, and Elias seized his chance. He rushed to the door, which was now visible again through the fog, its split frame trembling as if trying to hold itself in place. His hands gripped the edge, his nails scraping against the wood, and he pulled with all the strength he had left in him. Shadows snaked out, wrapping around his legs, but he pulled free, falling into the cold, damp air of the forest outside the window. The trees loomed overhead, still twisted into a cage, but a ray of moonlight broke through, guiding him. He ran, his lungs burning, the witch's laughter driving him like a storm. The ground beneath him softened, then gave way, and he fell, crashing into a hollow filled with bones, human bones, cracked and yellowed, some still clinging to scraps of flesh. He swallowed his gag, scratching at the outside, and looked back. The hut was gone, swallowed up in the fog, but her voice remained, soft and close. "You will come back. They always come back." Elias stumbled, the forest swallowing his sobs, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The blood on his hands wouldn't wash off, no matter how hard he wiped it away, and the hum, he could still hear it, faint but insistent, pulsing through his veins. A few hours later, he staggered out onto the familiar path, and the dawn was breaking in pale streaks above him. He told himself that it was all over, that he had been saved. But that night, as he lay in his bed many miles from the forest, He woke up to a creak in the window. A shadow appeared outside, tall and bent, and the buzzing began again, soft as a whisper, calling him back.